The Special Forces captain needed to know if the impossible shot could be made. He never expected the answer to come from the Armory cleaning lady. Sarah Chen sat at her workbench in the small workshop, methodically cleaning the barrel of a sniper rifle under the merciless desert sun. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a white glow across the rows of weapons that lined the walls. She had been doing this job for 7 years, and her fingers knew every curve, every mechanism, every tiny spring that made these machines work. Outside, the military base buzzed with its usual afternoon activity. Soldiers jogged past in formation, their boots hitting the pavement in rhythm. Helicopters landed and took off in the distance. But inside her workshop, Sarah existed in her own quiet world. No drama, no complications, just her and the weapons that needed her attention. The other soldiers barely noticed her. To them, she was just another face in the crowd, a quiet girl who worked in the back and never caused any trouble. Some of them didn't even know her name. She preferred it that way. The less attention she drew to herself, the better. Sarah had her reasons for staying invisible. Back home, she had spent 5 years training as an emergency medical technician. She had worked in busy city hospitals, handled trauma cases, and learned how to stay calm when everyone around her was panicking. Her instructors had always said she had a natural gift for medicine, steady hands, and a sharp mind that could assess a situation in seconds. But when she joined the military, things didn't go as planned. A bureaucratic error had placed her in logistics instead of the medical unit. Her paperwork had been lost somewhere in the system, and by the time anyone noticed, the medical positions were already filled. She was told to wait for the next rotation, that it would only be a few months. But months turned into a year, and she was still stuck organizing supplies instead of saving lives. She had tried to bring it up with her commanding officers, but they were always too busy, always had more pressing matters to deal with. Eventually, she stopped asking. The base was located in a remote area, far from any major cities. It was a staging ground for operations in the region, a place where soldiers would rest, resupply, and prepare for their next mission. The conditions were tough. The heat was unbearable during the day, and the cold at night could cut through even the thickest blankets. Sandstorms would roll in without warning, covering everything in a thick layer of dust. But the soldiers adapted. They always did. Sarah finished stacking the last crate and checked her watch. It was almost time for the supply truck to arrive. She walked outside and scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of movement. The desert stretched out in every direction, endless and empty. She had grown used to the isolation, the feeling of being cut off from the rest of the world. It was both peaceful and lonely at the same time. As she stood there, she heard voices coming from the medical tent nearby. It was busier than usual. She could see soldiers moving in and out, their faces tense with worry. Something was happening. She walked closer, staying just outside the entrance, and listened. One of the medics, Corporal Jensen, was talking in a low voice to another soldier. Sarah could hear the frustration in his tone. They were short on staff. 2 of their medics had been transferred to another base, and the remaining team was struggling to keep up with the workload. There had been an increase in injuries lately, mostly minor things like sprains and heat exhaustion. But it all added up. They were stretched thin. Sarah felt a pang of frustration. She could help them. She knew she could. But she also knew that stepping forward without permission could cause problems. The military was strict about protocol, about following orders and staying in your assigned role. She didn't want to make waves, didn't want to risk getting in trouble. So she turned away and went back to the supply tent. That evening, as the sun began to set and the temperature finally started to drop. Sarah sat outside her tent and watched the sky change colors. Orange and pink stretched across the horizon, and for a moment, everything felt calm. She thought about her life back home, about the hospital where she used to work, about the patients she had helped. She missed it. She missed the feeling of making a difference, of knowing that her skills mattered. She pulled out a small notebook from her pocket and began writing. It was a habit she had developed over the past year, a way to process her thoughts and keep herself grounded. She wrote about her day, about the supplies she had organized, about the voices she had heard from the medical tent. She wrote about her frustration, about feeling stuck in a job that didn't use her talents. But she also wrote about hope, about the belief that eventually things would change. As she was writing, she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up and saw Lieutenant Carter, one of the officers who oversaw logistics. He was a tall man with a serious expression, the kind of person who rarely smiled but was always fair. He stopped in front of her and nodded. Sarah quickly stood up and saluted. He returned the gesture and then relaxed his stance. He told her that the supply truck had been delayed. It wouldn't arrive until tomorrow afternoon. He wanted her to make sure everything was ready when it did arrive. She assured him that it would be. He turned to leave, then paused and looked back at her. He asked if she was settling in okay, if she had any problems with her assignment. It was a routine question, something officers asked from time to check on morale. Sarah hesitated for a moment. She could tell him about her medical training, about how she wanted to be transferred. But she had tried that before, and nothing had come of it. So she simply smiled and said she was fine. He seemed satisfied with her answer and walked away. Sarah sat back down and stared at her notebook. She knew she couldn't stay invisible forever. Eventually, something would have to change. She just didn't know when or how. The night grew darker, and the base became quiet. Most of the soldiers had retired to their tents, exhausted from the day's work. Sarah could hear the distant sound of generators humming, the occasional voice drifting on the wind. She closed her notebook and lay down on her cot, staring up at the canvas ceiling. Tomorrow would be another day of organizing supplies, counting inventory, and staying in the background. But somewhere deep inside, she felt a stirring, a sense that her time was coming. She didn't know what would trigger it, what event would finally pull her out of the shadows. But she could feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon. She closed her eyes and let herself drift off to sleep, her mind still turning over the possibilities. The desert night was silent around her, but inside, a quiet determination was growing stronger. The morning arrived with the usual routine. Sarah woke up before dawn, dressed quickly, and headed to the supply tent. The air was still cool, a brief relief before the sun would turn the desert into an oven. She unlocked the tent and began her inventory check, making notes of what supplies were running low and what needed to be restocked when the truck arrived. Around mid-morning, she heard shouting from across the camp. It wasn't the usual sound of soldiers training or joking around. This was different, urgent, panicked. She stepped outside and saw several soldiers running toward the medical tent. Her heart rate picked up. Something was wrong. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Every instinct told her to run toward the medical tent to see if she could help. But her orders were clear. Stay in the supply area. Don't interfere with other units unless requested. She clenched her fists, fighting the urge to move. Then she saw Corporal Jensen burst out of the medical tent, his face pale. He was looking around frantically, calling for anyone with medical training. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was serious. She watched as Jensen grabbed a passing soldier and asked if he knew first aid. The soldier shook his head and hurried away. Sarah took a step forward, then stopped. Her mind raced. If she stepped in now, she would be breaking protocol. She could face disciplinary action. But if someone was hurt and she did nothing, could she live with that? She thought about all the training she had received, all the hours she had spent learning how to save lives. What was the point of all that knowledge if she never used it? Before she could make a decision, another soldier came running toward her. It was Private Rodriguez, a young man she had spoken to a few times. His eyes were wide with fear. He told her that there had been an accident during a training exercise. A vehicle had overturned and several soldiers were injured. The medical team was overwhelmed. They needed help, anyone who knew anything about medicine. Sarah felt something shift inside her. This was her moment. She didn't hesitate any longer. She told Rodriguez to take her to the medical tent immediately. He looked surprised, but nodded and started running. She followed close behind, her mind already switching into emergency mode. When they reached the medical tent, the scene inside was chaotic. 3 soldiers were lying on cots, all of them injured. One had a deep gash on his leg that was bleeding heavily. Another was clutching his arm, his face twisted in pain. The third was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. Corporal Jensen and another medic were moving between them, trying to stabilize everyone at once, but it was clear they were struggling. Sarah stepped forward without being asked. She moved to the soldier with the leg wound and quickly assessed the situation. The bleeding was severe, but it hadn't hit an artery. She grabbed a pair of gloves from a nearby table and snapped them on. She asked for gauze and a tourniquet. Jensen looked up, surprised to see her there, but he didn't question it. He tossed her the supplies. She worked quickly, applying pressure to the wound and wrapping it tightly. Her hands moved with practiced precision, every motion automatic. She had done this dozens of times before in the hospital. The soldier groaned in pain, but she spoke to him in a calm, steady voice, telling him he was going to be okay, that she just needed him to stay still. Once the bleeding was under control, she moved to the second soldier. His arm was clearly broken, bent at an unnatural angle. She gently examined it, checking for nerve damage and making sure there were no bone fragments pressing against the skin. She instructed another soldier to bring her a splint and some bandages. While she waited, she continued talking to the injured man, keeping him focused on her voice instead of the pain. The third soldier was the most critical. He was still unconscious, and his breathing was becoming more labored. Sarah moved to his side and checked his airway. It was partially blocked. She tilted his head back and cleared his mouth, then checked his pulse. It was weak but steady. She suspected he had a concussion, possibly internal injuries. She told Jensen they needed to monitor him closely and be ready to administer oxygen if his condition worsened. For the next hour, Sarah worked alongside the medical team, moving from patient to patient, stabilizing injuries and providing care. She gave instructions with confidence, and the other medics followed them without question. There was no time to think about protocol or paperwork. There was only the work, the urgent need to help people who were suffering. Gradually, the chaos began to settle. The bleeding was stopped, the bones were set, and the unconscious soldier was breathing more easily. The worst of the crisis had passed. Sarah stepped back, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. She took a deep breath and looked around the tent. The soldiers were going to be okay. They would all recover. Corporal Jensen walked over to her, his expression a mix of relief and confusion. He asked her where she had learned to do all of that. She told him the truth. She had been trained as an emergency medical technician before joining the military. She had spent years working in hospitals, handling trauma cases just like this. She explained about the paperwork error, about being stuck in logistics when she should have been in the medical unit. Jensen stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head in disbelief. He said he had no idea. None of them did. He told her that she had just saved those soldiers' lives, that without her help, they might not have made it. Sarah felt a swell of emotion, but she kept her face neutral. She had only done what she was trained to do. As the medical team began cleaning up and preparing to transport the injured soldiers to a larger facility, word of what had happened started to spread through the camp. Soldiers who had been nearby during the emergency began talking about the girl from the supply tent who had jumped in and taken charge. They spoke with admiration and surprise. Who was she? Where had she come from? Sarah returned to the supply tent, her mind still processing everything that had just happened. She felt exhausted, but also strangely energized. For the first time in over a year, she had used her skills. She had made a difference, and it felt incredible. But she also knew that there would be consequences. She had stepped outside her assigned role without permission. Some officers might see that as insubordination. She could face disciplinary action, maybe even a reprimand on her record. But as she sat down and tried to calm her racing heart, she realized she didn't regret it. She would make the same choice again without hesitation. As the afternoon wore on, she heard footsteps approaching the tent. She looked up and saw Lieutenant Carter standing in the entrance. His expression was unreadable. He asked her to step outside. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. This was it. She was going to face the consequences of her actions. She followed him outside, standing at attention. He looked at her for a long moment, then asked her if what he had heard was true. Had she really provided medical care during the emergency? She confirmed that she had. She explained her background, her training, and the mistake that had kept her out of the medical unit. Lieutenant Carter listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he told her that what she had done was remarkable. He said that she had acted with courage and skill, and that the soldiers she had helped owed her their lives. But he also said that the situation was complicated. She had broken protocol, and there would need to be an official review of what had happened. Sarah nodded, accepting whatever would come next. She had made her choice, and she would stand by it. The next 2 days passed in a strange blur. Sarah continued her work in the supply tent, but now everything felt different. Soldiers who had never spoken to her before would nod as they walked past. Some even stopped to thank her for what she had done. Word had spread quickly through the base, and suddenly she was no longer invisible. Corporal Jensen visited her the morning after the incident. He brought her a cup of coffee and sat down outside her tent. He told her that all 3 soldiers were going to make full recoveries. The one with the leg wound would need some physical therapy, and the soldier with the concussion was being monitored closely, but they were all stable. He said it again, more firmly this time. She had saved their lives. Sarah felt a weight lift off her chest. Knowing that her actions had made a real difference gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. But Jensen also warned her that there was going to be an investigation. The commanding officers needed to understand what had happened and why someone from logistics had been involved in a medical emergency. He told her to be honest and straightforward when they asked her questions. She spent the next day preparing herself mentally for whatever was coming. She went over the events in her mind, making sure she could explain every decision she had made. She knew her actions had been necessary, but she also understood that the military valued order and structure. Breaking protocol, even for a good reason, could have serious consequences. On the third day, she was called to the command tent. It was a large structure in the center of the base where the senior officers worked. Sarah had never been inside before. She walked in and found herself standing in front of 3 officers seated behind a long table. Lieutenant Carter was there, along with Major Stevens, the base medical officer, and Captain Reynolds, who oversaw personnel assignments. They asked her to explain what had happened. Sarah spoke clearly and calmly, describing the emergency, her response, and the medical procedures she had performed. She explained her background as an emergency medical technician and the paperwork error that had kept her out of the medical unit. She didn't make excuses or try to deflect blame. She simply told the truth. Major Stevens asked her several technical questions about her training and experience. He wanted to know where she had studied, what kind of cases she had handled, and how long she had been working in emergency medicine. Sarah answered each question thoroughly. She could tell he was assessing her competence, trying to determine if she had truly been qualified to do what she did. Captain Reynolds asked why she had never reported the paperwork error more forcefully. Sarah admitted that she had tried early on, but had been told to wait. After months of waiting with no resolution, she had stopped pushing. She had assumed that the system would eventually correct itself. Now she realized that had been a mistake. She should have been more persistent. The questioning went on for nearly an hour. Finally, the officers dismissed her and told her they would review her case and make a decision. Sarah left the command tent feeling drained. She had no idea which way the decision would go. That evening, she sat outside her tent and watched the sunset again. The sky was painted in shades of purple and gold, and the desert seemed almost beautiful in the fading light. She thought about her future, about what she really wanted from her military career. She had joined because she wanted to serve, to use her skills to help people. But she had spent the last year feeling useless, trapped in a role that didn't fit her. Maybe this incident would finally change that. The next morning, Sarah was called back to the command tent. This time, only Major Stevens was there. He told her to sit down, and she did, her heart pounding. He looked at her with a serious expression, then finally spoke. He said that after reviewing her case and consulting with the other officers, they had made a decision. He told her that her actions during the emergency had been exemplary. She had demonstrated skill, composure, and courage under pressure. The soldiers she had helped were alive because of her. However, he also said that she had violated protocol by stepping outside her assigned duties without authorization. In a normal situation, that would warrant disciplinary action. Sarah held her breath, waiting for the verdict. Major Stevens continued. He said that given the circumstances and the outcome, they had decided not to pursue disciplinary measures. Instead, they were going to correct the paperwork error and transfer her to the medical unit, effective immediately. She would be working under his supervision, and he expected her to maintain the same level of professionalism she had shown during the emergency. He also said that he was going to recommend her for a commendation for her actions. She had gone above and beyond, and that deserved recognition. Sarah felt a rush of relief so powerful that she almost couldn't speak. She thanked him, her voice shaking slightly. Major Stevens nodded and told her to report to the medical tent the next morning. He also said that he was going to recommend her for a commendation for her actions. She had gone above and beyond, and that deserved recognition. As Sarah left the command tent, she felt like she was walking on air. Everything she had been working toward, everything she had hoped for, was finally happening. She was going to be a medic. She was going to do the work she had trained for. The frustration and disappointment of the past year seemed to melt away. She went back to the supply tent and began packing up her belongings. She didn't have much, just some clothes, personal items, and her medical textbooks. She had kept them with her all this time, reading them in her spare moments to keep her skills sharp. Now she would finally get to use them. Corporal Jensen stopped by that afternoon to congratulate her. He said he had heard the news and that the whole medical team was looking forward to working with her. He told her that they needed someone with her experience and that she would fit in well. Sarah thanked him and said she was ready to get started. That night, she wrote in her notebook one last time from the supply tent. She described the events of the past few days, the investigation, and the decision that had changed everything. She wrote about how grateful she felt, how vindicated, but she also wrote about the responsibility she now carried. Lives would depend on her skills and judgment. She couldn't afford to make mistakes. As she finished writing, she heard a commotion outside. Soldiers were gathering near the center of the base, talking excitedly. Sarah stepped out to see what was happening. Someone told her that a high-ranking officer was arriving the next day. General Hawkins, the regional commander, was coming to inspect the base and meet with the troops. Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness. She had never met a general before. She wondered if her recent actions would come up during the visit, but she pushed the thought aside. She had been cleared of any wrongdoing, and she had a new assignment to focus on. Whatever happened with the general's visit, she would handle it. She went back inside and lay down on her cot for the last time. Tomorrow, everything would be different. Tomorrow, she would start her new role as a medic. Tomorrow, she would finally be doing what she was meant to do. And as she drifted off to sleep, she felt a deep sense of peace. The waiting was over. Her time had come. Sarah woke up early the next morning with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in a long time. Today was her first official day as a medic. She dressed in her uniform, made sure everything was neat and proper, and headed toward the medical tent. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the base. When she arrived, Corporal Jensen was already there, preparing supplies for the day. He greeted her with a smile and told her to make herself at home. He gave her a quick tour of the tent, showing her where everything was stored and explaining the daily routine. There were medication logs to maintain, equipment to sterilize, and regular checkups to perform on soldiers who had minor ailments. It was straightforward work, but Sarah loved every minute of it. The morning passed quickly. Sarah helped Jensen with several routine cases, mostly soldiers dealing with dehydration, blisters from long marches, and minor sprains. She took each case seriously, treating every soldier with care and attention. She could see the relief on their faces when she explained what was wrong and how it would be treated. This was what she had been missing: the direct connection with people who needed help, the ability to make a difference in someone's day. Around mid-morning, the base started buzzing with activity. General Hawkins was scheduled to arrive within the hour, and everyone was preparing for his inspection. Soldiers were cleaning their equipment, straightening their uniforms, and making sure everything looked perfect. Officers were reviewing schedules and preparing reports. The entire base was on high alert. Sarah continued her work in the medical tent, trying not to get distracted by the commotion outside. Major Stevens came by to check on things and reminded everyone to be on their best behavior. He said the general was known for being thorough and asking tough questions. He wanted to make sure the medical unit made a good impression. Just before noon, Sarah heard the sound of helicopters approaching. She stepped outside and watched as 2 military helicopters landed on the far side of the base. A group of officers emerged, and in the center of them was General Hawkins. He was a tall man with gray hair and a commanding presence. Even from a distance, Sarah could see why he had risen to such a high rank. He carried himself with absolute confidence. The general and his entourage began their tour of the base, moving from one area to another. Sarah went back inside the medical tent and tried to focus on her work. She was organizing a supply cabinet when she heard voices approaching. She turned and saw Major Stevens entering with General Hawkins and several other officers. Stevens gave a brief overview of the medical facilities, explaining the capabilities and limitations of their setup. The general listened carefully, asking occasional questions about equipment, staffing, and recent cases. Then his eyes landed on Sarah. He asked Stevens who she was. Stevens introduced her as their newest medic, mentioning that she had recently been transferred from logistics. But before he could elaborate, one of the injured soldiers from the accident a few days earlier called out from a cot on the other side of the tent. It was the young man who had suffered the concussion. He was being monitored for a few more days before being cleared for duty. The soldier recognized the general and immediately tried to sit up straighter despite his injuries. He told the general that Sarah was the one who had saved him and the others when they had been hurt. He described how she had appeared during the chaos and taken control of the situation, working with a skill and calmness that had kept them all alive. General Hawkins turned his full attention to Sarah. He asked her to explain what had happened. Sarah felt her throat go dry, but she forced herself to speak clearly. She described the accident, the emergency response, and the medical procedures she had performed. She kept her explanation concise and factual, avoiding any attempt to make herself sound heroic. The general asked about her background. Sarah told him about her training as an emergency medical technician, her years working in hospitals, and the paperwork error that had kept her out of the medical unit. She explained that she had only recently been transferred to her proper role. Hawkins frowned and asked why such an error had not been caught sooner. Major Stevens stepped in, explaining that administrative mistakes sometimes happened in the system, especially during large-scale deployments. He said the situation had been corrected as soon as it was brought to his attention. The general was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he turned back to Sarah and asked her a direct question. He wanted to know why she had intervened during the emergency when it wasn't her assigned duty. She could have stayed in the supply tent and avoided any risk of disciplinary action. Why had she chosen to step forward? Sarah thought about her answer carefully. She told him that she had joined the military to serve, to use her skills to help people. When she saw soldiers in danger and knew she had the training to help them, staying back hadn't been an option. She understood that she had broken protocol. But in that moment, saving lives had been more important than following rules. The general studied her face for a long moment. Sarah held his gaze, refusing to look away. Finally, a slight smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. He turned to Major Stevens and the other officers. He said that what Sarah had done represented the best of what the military stood for. She had seen a problem, used her initiative, and acted decisively to save lives. Too often, he said, people became so focused on following procedures that they forgot the actual mission. Sarah had not forgotten. She had prioritized the welfare of her fellow soldiers above everything else. And that was exactly the kind of thinking he wanted to see in his units. He then said something that surprised everyone in the tent. He told Major Stevens that Sarah should be put in charge of developing a training program for non-medical personnel. Too many soldiers had basic first aid training, but nothing beyond that. If Sarah could teach others even a fraction of what she knew, it could save lives across the entire base. Stevens immediately agreed. It was an excellent idea. Sarah felt overwhelmed. Not only had she been transferred to the medical unit, but now she was being given a leadership role in creating a new training program. It was more than she had ever hoped for. General Hawkins turned back to Sarah one last time. He told her that she had done something remarkable. She had seen soldiers in crisis and responded with skill and courage. She had not waited for permission or worried about the consequences. She had simply done what needed to be done. And in his opinion, that made her exactly the kind of soldier the military needed. He then said the words that would echo through the base for weeks to come. He looked directly at her and stated clearly, so everyone could hear, that she had just saved the whole unit. Not just the 3 soldiers from the accident, but potentially many more in the future through the training she would provide. Her actions had set an example that would inspire others to step up when needed. Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. She stood at attention and thanked the general. He nodded, gave her a crisp salute, which she returned, and then moved on to continue his inspection. After the general and his entourage left, the medical tent erupted in quiet celebration. Jensen clapped Sarah on the back, and Stevens shook her hand, congratulating her on the recognition. Other soldiers who had witnessed the exchange spread the word quickly. By afternoon, everyone on the base knew that the girl from the supply tent had been personally commended by General Hawkins himself. Sarah tried to process everything that had happened. In less than a week, her entire life had changed. She had gone from being invisible to being recognized by one of the highest-ranking officers in the region. She had proven herself in a crisis and earned a position that would allow her to make a lasting impact. That evening, as she sat outside the medical tent and watched the sun set over the desert, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had been given a second chance, an opportunity to do the work she loved, and she was determined not to waste it. She would develop the best training program possible, teach as many soldiers as she could, and make sure that when emergencies happened in the future, more people would be ready to respond. The invisible girl was invisible no more. She had found her place, and she was ready to make it count.